Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next panel. And I'm just going to go ahead and invite our panelists up to the stage as well. Hello. Everyone. All right. So I want to introduce our panelists today. We have Yasmine Sherif. She is Director of Education Cannot Wait. We also have Jane Mann, the Cambridge Partnership for Education Managing Editor with Cambridge University Press. We will hopefully have Robert Jenkins of UNICEF, but he's here. Okay, the elevator. So we will, I'll do a quick intro, and as soon as that elevator comes up, I'm sure we'll be joined by him. So, so as you know, so the title here, Reimagining Education, I think we've heard many times that when it comes to COVID and how it has set education back, we've heard the warning that we're about to lose an entire generation. It's almost become cliche, but it's not hyperbole. According to UNICEF, at the moment, 1 in 3 10-year-olds around the world cannot read and understand a simple written story. What's more shocking is that this figure is a 50% drop from before the pandemic. The Transforming Education Summit, held on the sidelines of UNGA earlier this week, was an effort to elevate this learning loss onto the global agenda. Over 130 countries made various commitments following 115 national consultations on issues from psychosocial well-being to gender equality to digital solutions. It's a whole lot of commitments. So I wanted to start by just getting everyone's reaction to the summit and whether you are optimistic that those commitments will ultimately come to fruition. You can start, yeah.
It's working. Yeah, you can hear me, right? It's okay? Well, I'm losing my voice. Let me say this. Now, I've been around quite some time in the UN system. I've been in civil society as well. But there are 2 things I want to say. Never, ever before has education been at the center as it has been this week at the UN, as long as I can remember. So that is an achievement, that education is at the center, has moved from the margin to the center. Now, looking back at my experience, I also know that every year commitments are being made. Every year action plans are being made. And the challenge is always, how do you translate a commitment into action? And I think that's where we need to press for concrete action, accountability. And from where I sit as heading the Education Cannot Wait Global Fund in the UN, for us, action means funding. Why does it mean funding? Because a lot of what we have discussed this week in New York, as my colleagues can testify, Rob and others, has been happening for a long time on the ground. Civil society, UN agencies, host governments, they are out there. We are working with partners who are right now implementing and supporting secondary education for girls in different provinces in Afghanistan, despite the ban. We now have colleagues from UNICEF, UNESCO, WFP, Save the Children, and many others who are working in Central African Republic across 12 different militia lines, a country hardly controlled by the government. In Yemen, it's happening, but the challenge is funding. So any action of this kind when it comes to social or basic service or a development sector requires funding. It's not enough to make a commitment. Now, those who have the wealth as governments, as private sectors, as high net worth individuals. We need you to make this happen and continue to scale up. Finally, another takeaway from, and I think this is the most important, and Education Cannot Wait, we have our high-level funding conference in Geneva in February 2023, hosted by the government of Switzerland, co-convened by Norway, South Sudan, Niger, and Germany. What I did see that was different from anything else before, there was a very, very powerful presence of youth rocking and shaking the United Nations, and supported by the Secretary General. We mustn't lose them, because they are the rebels. They are the ones who are fearless and ready to speak up and hold that accountability. We saw a strong focus on gender, but again, words are not enough. Action, and we need the funding. And I'll leave it there. Finally, though, there wasn't sufficiently strong focus on refugees' inclusion in public education systems. So we need to hold the flag for refugees around the globe who are lost in countries others than their own, and who need and have a right to access a public education. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure you're not the only one who's thinking the word action. So, Jane, what are some of your thoughts on TES?
Yeah, thanks very much. And nodding a lot with what Yasmine was saying there. Cambridge Partnership for Education is an implementing partner. So when I sit and listen to what was being said, I am immediately thinking about all of those ministry partners that we speak to every week, and what that actually looks like when you start to try and implement a program. Absolutely, funding critical, because without the funding, you don't get the programs. But also, I think that we heard a lot around relevance. We heard around how do we actually make sure that these big ideas that we've all got general consensus around can become relevant where they are being delivered. We heard about relevance in curriculum, like what does a curriculum look like for a world that's in a climate crisis? What does relevant curriculum look like for girls and the most marginalized, for displaced learners? We also heard around relevance of technology. And it was really great to hear a move, I think, away from those more blunt, old-fashioned policies with technology around that kind of last moment with the student, and more into the supporting systems with really practical, relevant technology. And anyone lucky enough to have been in the session with the Indonesian Minister, Makarim, I know you were there, Rob, and to hear about his phenomenal use of technology in his own system, can't have failed to have been impressed. And the point there was around making it absolutely relevant for his system and his teachers. And the youth voice, again, I thought that, the youth voice brings that relevance, and it reminds us that everything we do now has to be relevant for them, not only now, but in the future. And there's a couple of things in there I just want to unpack a bit. So in the future, I wanted to hear more about long-term planning. I know it's difficult. I know that average tenure of a Minister of Education pre-COVID was 22 months. Goodness only knows what it is now. I think in the UK, we've had 4 education ministers in about the last 3 weeks. But I think long-term planning is really important to hold on to. I also think that it was great the youth voices were there, but there were voices missing, in my opinion. I wanted to hear more from teachers. I also wanted to hear more from those coalition of those implementing partners, the people writing the assessment items, the people publishing the books, the people on the ground trying to create the things that make all of this happen. I wanted to hear it from their perspective as well.
Thank you. Robert, what were some of your key takeaways from the Transforming Education Summit?
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to see Jane and Yasmine, dear friends and colleagues and partners. And thanks. I look forward to hearing other people's thoughts. So it was interesting. So good things, and then maybe some challenging things. Good things were a lot of very senior decision makers, a lot of heads of state, a lot of ministers of education, a lot of private sector, and a lot of youth and energy, etc. So a lot of people. And it's great to have such senior people, a lot of people talking about education. So that's good. I think there was not a sufficient consensus, the way we would see it at UNICEF, on the urgent need for action, the kind of level of crisis that the world is facing, and the need for a crisis response. Now, there were some ministers and some heads of state, definitely, that were, and as a couple were mentioned here, and it was so great to hear some of their vision and some of their immediate. I think, though, in general, we still have some ways to go to convince all that we need to urgently respond to the learning crisis that was existing before COVID. It's been exacerbated. I know that's been much discussed, and it was even discussed here in Devex. I think on the transformation part, so urgent response, yeah. Now, transformation. Again, we had some amazing leaders present some transformative ideas. The challenge now, and I think a lot of people said this at the summit, is the follow-up. Is it going in a year from now, if we're all back here and we say, remember a year ago there was a summit, a lot of big ideas, how much did that translate into concrete change for children on the ground, particularly in very challenging places around the world? But frankly, it's a global crisis too. So did it affect anyone within 3 miles of this building here? I think we still need to now collectively work out how to make sure that that indeed this statements and these outcomes and this commitments translate into practical action. Maybe that's the last thing on that is I felt there was an overwhelming message around the importance of leadership and accountability. And if you're going to come away with one thing, I think it is where there's leaders who are accountable, you have urgent action, you have change. Where there isn't, it's a real struggle. So then it comes to organizations like that we all represent and others to figure out how do we promote greater leadership, better leadership, how do we promote greater accountability?
Now, Robert, we'll go ahead and stay with you on my next question. I mean, we've all talked about action. I mean, one of the supposedly concrete announcements that came out of the summit was the International Finance Facility for Education, or IFED.
Yeah.
It's being billed as the biggest ever investment in education, the potential to unlock $10 billion in additional funding by 2030. The proposal has actually been floating around for several years, and while the Asian and African development banks are on board, notably the World Bank is not. So let's start with you, Robert. I mean, what are your thoughts on IFED and its ability to be this transforming finance vehicle as it says it will be?
So let me come to IFED in 30 seconds, but just quickly on money overall in the education sector. We all know broadly in education sector, there isn't enough money in the education sector. Yasmine quite rightly pointed it out. If you look at a graph on the average per child spend in low-income countries to high-income countries per child, the amount of money spent in education, you can't put it on the same graph, right? It's like $45 compared to 2,500. So we have an terribly unequal allocation of resources. I think, as maybe everyone knows, even in low-income countries, the vast majority, over 90% of education funding comes from the country themselves. So the whole global community and all of us, and we all think that we're making a big difference, we're all in the less than 10%, most countries less than 5%. All the money is coming from national governments, from parents, from communities. Now, having said all that, maybe I'll just also say we still need a long ways to go on how money is spent efficiently and effectively, targeting foundational learning, ensure that it makes a real change. And it's terribly unequal, not only between governments, but between countries, but there isn't a country in the world that gives 20% of public resources to the 20% poorest children. Not any country, meaning the poorest 20% of their kids, there's not a single country that access their fair share of resources. There's some countries that spend $10 for the top 20% compared to the bottom 20% in terms of economics. So massive inequalities. So big conversations need to happen on funding of education. Now, IFED, I think it's a big step forward, particularly for certain countries that require additional financing to enable them to leapfrog from, say, middle income level into sort of transform their education systems to fuel growth. And we know economically how many countries get sort of stuck in these middle income traps. I think if it can indeed enable a leapfrogging and enable countries to grow out of those situations. So I think it's really an exciting initiative, but hopefully will not distract from the bigger conversation on education financing globally.
Yasmine, what are some of your thoughts on IFED?
Yeah, I think IFED was launched some time ago, but the fact that it was now endorsed by the United Nations and finally put put out there. I think that is probably the most transformative outcome of the Education Summit. I really consider IFID, and I've studied it in depth and spent a lot of time with the Education Commission, and also a lot of the thinking around that. Whoever has been involved has the credentials for developing bigger systems to save economies and to deliver basic services. So with the UN Special Envoy Gordon Brown at the helmet of that, I have absolute trust that that is moving in the right direction. And the way we look at things today, first are 2 points. One is everything is about pooled funding today. So we have GPE, who have their advantage, comparative advantage. We have ECW, we have our added value, and we are the ones who are out in the hardest crisis hit countries. And then we have IFID. There is no competition between us, and we cannot compete because just in crisis there are 222 million children. Nobody wants alone to say, we can take care of that by ourselves. We need at least 3 strong funding mechanisms, each with their own comparative advantages. And then we have great partners on the ground, such as UNICEF being one of them, other UN agencies, other NGOs. Obviously, UNICEF is the lead agency on education emergencies. So they obviously play a key role here as an implementer and policy setter as well, of course. But what IFID does always reminds me of how you shift and create a better socioeconomic balance in a country or in the world. In Sweden, where I come from, you can borrow at very low interest rate for your student loan, and you have 50 years to pay it back. The interest rate is very, very low, but you go out and you get your master's degree or your PhD, and it feels like it costs you nothing. And then you pay it back over time. And that's precisely what IFID is doing. It allows you to go all the way to do the real education reform that is required for a country, rebuilding from conflict, hosting large refugee populations, putting a strain on the national system. So it's allowing the lower income, the middle income, but the lower income above all, or recovering countries to do it properly. Because I have to say this, GPE, ECW, we do great work, we all agree, we hold hands, this is great, but you cannot change the world on grants alone. You need to front load bigger money for change. And that is the transformation that IFID is bringing. So I think that complementarity is right on time, and Education Cannot Wait fully supports IFID.
Well, we know where you stand. Jane, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Unlike Yasmine, I haven't studied the IFID in depth. However, like Yasmine, I do believe in needing funds to do it properly. And I know that where that sits a lot of the time is around government's abilities to know where their problems are. And I think what we need more funding for, and what I've started to see happen more, which is very encouraging, is governments actually starting to use their funding for really great analysis at the beginning. It's a hard thing to do if you only have very limited funds, because you want to almost get down to action super quickly. So the tendency to go to the most visible type of action is strong. But where more funding is available, it allows governments to be more careful in what they're doing, which ultimately means that they'll be spending less than they may have done to get more great outcomes for their work. We've seen increasingly that kind of health check approach, where the funds are available, save massive amount of resources down the line, save time, and deliver better outcomes. So hopefully the funding will enable that kind of thing, that the do it properly approach. I also think that it's important to see more quality expectations linked to funding as well. Speaking as a partner that helps the ministries to spend the funding, helps the people doing it on the ground to know where to put the money. If you link the quality expectations to the funding, not only do you start to see the quality coming out, but everyone competes on it. People compete to be the best quality because they know that that's the only way that they're going to get access to the funding. So I'd like to see more of those mechanisms.
Now, in terms of education spending, it had been growing. I mean, to be fair, over years, there has been increases, but not nearly to the extent that was needed. And that was before the pandemic, which then decimated a lot of economic budgets all around the world. So it's quite a tall ask to want more education money from economically struggling governments, whether they're low-income nations or high-income nations who are slashing their aid budgets left and right. So, to be blunt, isn't a donor-funded kind of ribbon cutting of a new road kind of more politically appealing, but also practical at the moment than investing in something where there's a return, but you're not going to see that return for possibly 20 years or more? So what's if you had one message to say to governments and to donors, why is this long-term investment worth it, given the million other pressing needs that each government is facing? Robert, we'll start with you.
The evidence is absolutely clear that particularly early childhood education, the return on investment, $7, $8 to $1 spend. So there's no question on the economic benefits of allocating resources to education, allocating resources to early childhood education in particular, particularly, again, if it's efficiently and effectively spent. So I think actually the challenge we really have now is there is this fiscal pressure immediately. And if we just focus on the immediate short term and compromise on the education resources to support the recovery and the transformation of education, we're meeting short term by economic stimulus package or something, compromising the medium long term development and social change of a country. That's the tension we have. And as we see time and time again, countries that invest well and effectively in education over the medium and long, short-term immediate benefits for those individual children, but medium and long-term for social and development change. So we have to collectively, and I'd really encourage everyone in this room to continue to send the same messages to decision makers of the importance of investing in today's generation to enable a brighter future for all.
Yasmine, what message would you convey?
Thank you so much. I borrowed your pen. What marks a leader? What makes a leader different from a non-leader or a follower? Okay, a leader has a long-term vision, and a quick fixer or a politician who just wants to have immediate results is not necessarily a leader. And the reason the world looks like it looks today on climate change, extreme poverty, the number of children who are suffering in conflict and adolescents not accessing a quality education has gone from 75 million to 222 million, extreme poverty, hunger, you name it, every single human right and every sustainable development goal remains unrealized. And we will all agree, where is the visionary leadership? That kind of leadership that ended apartheid, that led the civil rights movement, that saw long term. That's the leadership the world needs today. And that means thinking long term. And education, so that's the first thing a leader sees. They can think long term. They're not out in a popularity context. They're out with a sense of responsibility to do something for Mother Earth, for humanity, for the children of the world. Okay? So it's up to the youth now to determine if that is the leadership we have, and it's also up to the voters going every time there's an election. Secondly, a leader knows how to connect dots. Anyone who claims to be a leader and cannot see that education is the foundation for all sustainable development goals, any leader who cannot see that education is essential if you want to end extreme poverty, if you want to achieve gender equality, if you want to ensure access to health, water, public services, all the development goals, again, is that a leader? Because leaders know how to connect dots, and they know that before we can achieve any sustainable development goal, or before we can achieve all human rights, every human being needs to know how to read, write, think creatively, be able to develop their potentials, be able to exercise democratic governance, be able and empowered through an education. So I think That's where accountability and leadership comes in. That's where we count on the young people, but also on our narrative, and also the importance of us manifesting that kind of leadership. That we are here in for the long haul, because we have a lot of rebuilding to do in this world, when 222 million kids sitting in camps in the darkest corners of the world, their homes burned down, more wars are created, climate change is escalating, and the number of children and youth out of school keep growing in a shocking speed.
It is.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Jane, can you wrap us up with
Absolutely.
how would you convince everyone?
Oh,
No pressure.
During COVID, we had lots of roundtables with ministers on Zoom, and I wanted at the end of it all to run a session called "Are You Serious?" Because there was so much commitment in those conversations from those ministers in the moment, determination to really make a change. And you know what? It didn't actually hold. You know, we're now in this perfect storm of crises. Ministers have so many things on their desks. The commitment that we saw when we just had the big one that we're all focusing on, it's really hard to sustain now. So I think, as well as manifesting that leadership that you're talking about, Yasmine, we need to really help those governments. We need to throw our weight and our arms around them to say, for everything that you do that we know was the right decision, we're going to amplify it. We're going to give you the data you need so that you can make those decisions. We're going to showcase what you're doing. We're going to give you the quick wins, because you know that you're going to have to show those quick wins if you're going to get the time to invest in the long term. And I think we need to be, just having blatant PR campaigns around the best ministers making the best decisions. How can we make sure that that kind of great practice is spread around the world?
Well, great advice. Thank you, all three of you, for these powerful words. And thank you, everyone, for this panel.
Thank you. Thank you.